All right, and we're back again. Dr. Feist here, and we're still in Book 5. We're doing Chapter 2 in this video, and it's Course of the Nicomachean Ethics. So I'm here with the piggy banks, and no piggy banks were harmed in the making of this video. So what are we doing here? Again, we're talking about justice. We've seen Aristotle has split the notion of justice up. He's talked about injustice, and he's making all kinds of distinctions. Now, I'm not entirely sure that all these distinctions that Aristotle is making line up perfectly, but there's some key points that he's trying to make and that I will focus on in this video here. So we have justice in the large sense, the whole, and we've seen that that's mostly more or less coextensive with virtue. Justice in the narrow sense is like a relation of a part to a whole. Now, Aristotle typically, as we've seen, when he tries to approach justice, he approaches it first through injustice. And but how do we know there is such a thing as injustice? Well, again, as we've seen, Aristotle is a philosopher who's interested in looking at what people say. So he says, well, we talk about injustice, so let's have a look at that. And if you read the text closely, you'll notice quite often how Aristotle will say, well, this is what people say, so we can take it as at least something plausible or something that we should dig into and examine. So Aristotle is always trying to link what his philosophy to what the common person says and go a little bit deeper. And as I mentioned in previous videos, many philosophers do that. All right, so how should we approach the search for this justice in the narrow sense? That's a part of justice in the large sense. We're going to look at it through injustice, and Aristotle gives us a few examples. Again, Aristotle examples are quite easy and very simple ones. The person who throws away, okay, so here's a number of them. The person who, for example, throws away a shield in battle out of, we would say, say cowardice. Well, we would say that is a form of injustice. That's an unjust thing to do. You desert your colleagues. Aristotle says that, yes, this is a wicked thing. So we talk about this notion here of this particular situation, that is the throwing away of the shield in battle. We say, yeah, that's an unjust, that's an example of injustice. That's an unjust thing to do. And it's a product of cowardice, or its wickedness can be reduced down to cowardice. The second one, have a look at that. The person who speaks abusively in anger. That too is something wicked. That too is an injustice towards someone else. And in that case, what does Aristotle say? Well, due to some kind of bad temper or intemperate. Right? So somebody who has a wickedness of a bad temper or intemperate, something like that. So again, it's an injustice, but we would frame it ultimately in terms of this particular, like we did for throwing away the shield. We said it's an injustice, but we framed it, the wickedness, in terms of cowardice. Well, the same sort of line will go here. Imagine the person who refuses to financially help a friend. Well, why? Because they're stingy or cheap or whatever. In that sense, their wickedness, their injustice, we would frame it in terms of their stinginess. All right, so we've got these particular examples, cases of wickedness, but remember what we talked about earlier. There was something that Aristotle wanted to concentrate on that was a particular part of the particular notion of injustice. And he was worried about people that are always trying to be unfair. They are sort of the greedy-minded. They want, by being unfair, they want more than their share. So the greedy person then is trying to get his or her larger portion than what's due to them. So there is a notion of what's due to someone in Aristotle's thought, and these people are not really being greedy. So it's not really greed here, right? They're not demanding more than their share, at least what Aristotle is pointing out here. So there's basically what he's pointing out is there's all different ways to be wicked, and we would classify them as being unjust or examples of injustice, but they're not necessarily greed. But the person, the greedy person, so is not unjust due to cowardice, bad temper, but the greedy person is still unjust. So the greedy person is unjust. But you don't have something else that you can reduce it down to, like you did in these cases when you called them unjust, and then we reduced it down to cowardice or bad temper or being stingy. So the greedy person is an unjust person, no question there. Aristotle gives us a number of other examples, like the person who commits adultery, like two people commit a couple of cases of adultery. So Aristotle says if you do that for something like some kind of financial gain or some kind of personal gain you get out of it, is unjust, greedy, but not necessarily intemperate. If someone commits adultery just out of appetite, right? Then Aristotle says, well, that's not out of greed. That's being someone who's intemperate. So you have to look at all these things quite carefully in order to figure out what exactly is going on. So the conclusion, more or less, of this discussion with these examples is that many unjust acts are reduced down to different forms of wickedness, but there is the one, namely the greedy, the greedy of the unjust act is just simply the greedy, full stop. Okay, you don't go any further and reduce it down anymore. All right, so particular justice then that Aristotle wants to concentrate on, particular justice, not injustice, but particular justice is going to be the notion of the whole idea of fair share. People getting a fair share. That's what he's talking about when he's dealing with particular justice. This notion of fairness, equal distribution. Now, when you start digging into philosophical terms like equal, we should be careful, because treating people equally does not mean treating them identically. Right? As we often know, if we wanted to treat two people equally, we might have to take into account lots of differences they may have in order to give them what we would call a level playing field. So treating people equally doesn't mean identically. So keep that in mind, and Aristotle is well aware of that. So particular justice will involve people getting their fair share. So there are different kinds of goods. Now, if we think about it in a larger context, that is the context of society, there will be different kinds of goods that we can get our fair shares of. There will be divisions, all kinds of divisions in the notion of particular justice. So when we're thinking about fair shares and particular injustice, people being greedy and being unfair, trying to get more than their fair share, Aristotle is going to say, well, that ramifies. So there's all different kinds of particular justice, all different kinds of particular injustice. So as I said at the beginning of the video, there's all kinds of distinctions that Aristotle is making in Book 5 with regards to justice, and we'll see that he'll pick up a lot of these ideas again later on in the Politics. All right, so Aristotle is going to look at two kinds in the later chapters. So he gives us sort of a little bit of a heads up as to where he's going. He's going to consider two kinds of particular justice. In chapter 3, he's going to look at the sharing of honor and money. So this will be the sharing of honor and money. Okay. So Aristotle mixes a little economics in with his discussions of justice. So, and who's sharing it? Well, the members of society. Okay, so the sharing by whom? Members of society. And we're talking again, right, about proper, fair sharing. How do you work all that out? The sharing of honor in society. We could, as we would say now, this is really about Distributive justice. Right? How you have all kinds of goods in society. How should they be parceled out? How should they be shared amongst the people in society? And remember, treating everybody equally may not be treating them identically, quite differently. In fact, as a matter of fact, if you go back to Plato's Republic, a key idea in that was that treating people fairly is going to be treating them according to something about them. So in other words, it wouldn't be regarding everyone as identical and then saying, oh, well, the treatment has to be the same for everyone. No, Plato says that, people are different. They have different abilities, and some of those abilities are you're just born that way. So if you want to treat people fairly, you're going to have to treat them in a certain way that takes into account those abilities or lack of abilities or however. So you will be treating people differently, but it would still be fair or appropriate. And justice would be treating people while taking into account their differences. So chapter 3 then will look at this notion of particular justice in this first one, the sharing of honor and money by the members of society, and that we would call distributive justice, although Aristotle doesn't really use that term. The next chapter, where he's looking at another notion of, or another kind of particular justice, is in 4. This would be looking at the justice of transactions. So we can see clearly that we're getting into some discussions of economics. So this would involve transactions between individuals. So Aristotle is doing a little bit of economics, and in this sense, he says, well, this is rectificatory justice. And in rectificatory justice, he's looking at the fairness of deals. So again, don't forget, it's fairness. All right, so the fairness of these transactions, and these are involving individuals, right, in the state, and how to make sure that that's done fairly. Now, this is going to, not surprisingly, break into a couple of parts. So in chapter 4, when he goes into the various transactions regarding individuals, he'll say, well, there's 2 parts to this. There's the voluntary. So these transactions break into 2 parts. Here's our old friend that we've seen from an earlier video, the voluntary, and the other one, not surprisingly, the involuntary. So the voluntary and the involuntary. So the voluntary is, not surprisingly, is when both individuals or everybody who's involved, usually it's thought of as between 2 individuals. The voluntary is when the individuals, they know what's going on. It's open. So it would be something like, buying, selling, lending money with interest, how you work those things out. So people get together and they lend money around to each other and they charge interest, etc., etc. And there's a variety. Aristotle gives a little list of these. You can have a look at that at the end of chapter 2. So, but then there's the involuntary in the notion of personal transactions, and this too splits into a couple parts. Well, this is when things are, again, involuntary, that might be outside of the will or against the will. Remember the subtleties that Aristotle introduced with the notion of the involuntary. If you don't remember that, you're going to have to head back to an earlier video. In this, when he splits this up in the involuntary, it could be secret or by force. So secret, by force. All right, so involuntary deals that could be secret would be things like theft, poisoning, adultery. So theft, poisoning, adultery, and so on. Kind of running out of room on the board here. But the one that's interesting here, and it comes up, we'll see it come up again, is one of the things that Aristotle regards as unjust, that's not a just thing, is if you try and entice someone's slave away from them. So if you offer a slave of another citizen who owns a slave, and you try to get that slave to run away or help that slave in some way, or offer that slave, I don't know, wages or something. In other words, just something to entice the slave away, that it's not forcing the slave to do it, but like making it attractive to leave. That's a form of injustice according to Aristotle. So justice, he's giving us a heads up here. So anything, so there's another controversial notion here with Aristotle, is that when you're trying to decrease the amount of slavery or change it in some way, even by like enticing it to decrease or change, Aristotle says that that's problematic, and that would be some kind of secret deal, presumably secret because of the slave owner wouldn't know about it. So we'll see a lot in the politics about slavery, and you can see just how controversial it is. But you see it even showing up here in the notion, in his discussions of particular justice, namely the one under the rectificatory. There's a number of others so then when we move away from the secret and go to the involuntary by force, we're looking at things like assault, slander. So assault, slander, maiming. There's a whole bunch he lists. All right. So, and that will be his discussions in Chapter 4. He will go into this in more detail. So you can clearly see that, he's building up this huge notion, or this huge set of interrelated concepts, that is subdivisions, all within the notions of justice and injustice. All right, so it can get pretty confusing, and it's not entirely clear that this all fits together perfectly, because once again, as I said in an earlier video, these are lecture notes of Aristotle's. They're not polished work. So chances are quite strong that if we were to have his polished works, this would be a little bit clearer. Might be more complex, but it could be clearer. Chapter 5 then is going to look at more issues revolving reciprocity. And Aristotle is aware that reciprocity and justice is quite complex. So we're now getting into the notions of what do you do when something has been, let's say, for example, stolen, and whatever has been stolen is irretrievable. How do you make amends for that? How do you adjust for that? What do you do when the object of value is gone? So that's what he'll talk about in Chapter 5. So now, as I said, this gets all a bit complex, but I'll show you one way that you could start to summarize it. Not perfect, but it starts to give a little bit of a picture of it. So to get a bit of a handle on this, we could encapsulate some of this discussion roughly as follows. And again, I say roughly because I'm not convinced this is all entirely consistent and coherent in this discussion, but the main ideas, I think, are fairly clear. So if we think of two drawings, this is sort of justice unlawful. So this is the notion of general justice. This is general injustice. This, the whole general justice, this is really coextensive with virtue as a whole, and injustice, unlawful, is, I don't think of it as a vice as a whole. All right, so inside of each, then you have particular injustice, because Aristotle says Quite often, particular justice is related to general justice as a part to a whole. Particular here, particular injustice. And again, particular injustice is related to general injustice, part to whole. So you have that way of thinking about it. So with the particular justice, you'll have distributive justice. So you have distributive justice in particular justice. And remember I talked about how there are a few of these different kinds of particular justice. So you would have refractory in here as well. All right. So in that sense, you've got refractory, distributive justice within inside of particular justice, and all within justice as a whole. So it's basically Aristotle trying to tell the story of parts of wholes and parts of wholes, and to try and keep this as organized as you can. Same thing here for the particular injustice. So particular justice, particular injustice as well has its parts. And in that sense, we could say things like, okay, so an unjust act, right? The person, remember from a little while ago, I've erased it, but when Aristotle laid out those particular examples of throwing away your shield in battle, that was a wicked act. It was unjust. It was a particular injustice because the person may not be committing all the things. It might be committed out of cowardice, but not a different form of wickedness, but that particular form. So cowardice might be the particular injustice here, and it's a wickedness, but it's reduced down to cowardice. And again, you can go back and look at those examples. The intemperate was another one. And what he seems to be saying is that the other ones or the other main one that he talked about, that you could not reduce its form of wickedness down to one of these, it's an particular unjust act. This is where the greedy is. All right. So this is, remember, the greedy is the unfair more than her share. That's what's going on in this one. So the greedy is not reducible down to a further subcategory. So in that sense, we've got roughly the picture that Aristotle wants to talk about, and then in subsequent chapters, he's going to start concentrating on this. And what Aristotle is going to do, which is quite interesting, is he'll talk about the different ways that we try to measure justice, because it gets complex as the human interactions become increasingly complex. The injustice, you can think of it this way, the justice and the justice of the interactions become increasingly complex. So if it's the case that we live in a society, imagine if you lived in a society where everybody could make every product. So each person made his or her own food, his or her own furniture, etc., etc. That would pretty well be an impossible society to have no division of labor. But it's just work with me. It's just an example to illustrate the emerging complexity. If everybody could, in our fictional little society, make everything, then the justice and the injustice wouldn't be too bad, because it could be quite a straightforward sense of simple reciprocity. So if for example, I steal something, I steal my neighbor's chair, and I'm using it, well, the law would say give the chair back. If I take, let's say, a loaf of bread from my neighbor, and I use it, which means to eat it, it's not something I can give back. I can't give that loaf of bread back, but by a simple replacement principle, because I can make my own food, I bake a loaf of bread and I give that back to the neighbor. And the only thing we would worry about is to make sure that if I ate a loaf of bread that was of certain mass or size, or however the measurements you want to describe them, I return the equivalent amount. So in that sense, it could be quite easy. But think about how complex when we take a society that has all kinds of divisions of labor. And that's getting much closer to where the society we live in, and certainly even the society of Aristotle's time, because there were people that were good at certain things and they contributed. Remember way back at the beginning of the Nicomachean Ethics when he talked about the hierarchy of how people fit into the hierarchy of goods, right? Bridle makers were to fit in with other people all the way up to generals and things like that, and then the good of society. Well, when you have more complex societies, all this stuff becomes increasingly complex. All this stuff now turns to questions of how to measure and find proportions between goods that are quite different from each other. So what do I do now when I steal a loaf of bread? What does the law say that I should do when I steal a loaf of bread and I don't know how to make bread? Right? I said, well, one of the reasons why I took it. I was hungry and I don't know how to make it. So how do I pay back? How do we find an equivalent, like a non-bread equivalent for bread? So that raises other kinds of problems in justice. And so what Aristotle is going to do is go through a bunch of these problems, and you'll see just how complex it gets in the Nicomachean Ethics regarding justice in Book 5. And then, of course, in the politics, he's going to pick the same thing up again. And we'll see, as we've already seen with the issue of slavery, it's going to be at times quite different than the way that we think today, and indeed quite controversial. But we'll pick that up again in a later video. See you in the next video.